They mocked Paul Blake for adopting 3 black boys, believing he'd regret it in the end. But years later, those same folks are on their knees, pleading for forgiveness. What has pushed them to such desperation? Before we begin, please leave a comment below indicating where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this tale, please subscribe. Paul Blake drove his old pickup truck through the familiar streets of Greenville with worn-out hands on the wheel. Like the questions that crept into his mind, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the road. But Paul didn't give up when questions came up, not when the lives of 3 young people were at stake. He took a quick look at the manila package on the passenger seat. It had Isaac, Kingsley, and Mike's adoption papers inside. A terrible car accident took the lives of the boys' parents just 2 months ago. Paul became close to the family while remodeling their home. The boys, in particular, had grown to like him as a worker and had watched him work with interest. He felt his throat get tight as he thought about the 3 young boys' faces. At the funeral, they were holding on to each other, their worlds broken. Isaac, the oldest at 10, was trying to be strong for his younger brothers. Kingsley, who is 8 years old and usually very active, was standing still and looking lost. And Mike, who is only 7 years old, was quietly crying into his brother's sleeve. He asked himself in a low voice, what would Melinda think? He was thinking of his late wife. They had always wanted kids, but they never got any. At age 52, he was about to have 3 boys who needed him as a father. As the truck went by Mrs. Johnson's house, Paul saw her peeking out from behind her curtains. It was already being said by other people. He had heard the rumors at the hardware shop and seen people with their eyebrows raised at church. They lived in a small town where one white guy adopted 3 black brothers. This wasn't very common, but Paul didn't care. He cared about what was right and raw, love and duty. He had a house that these boys could live in. They needed direction from a father, and even though he wasn't perfect, he knew he could give it to them. As he thought about what Isaac had said at their last meeting with the social worker, his hands got tighter on the wheel. You really want all of us together? The boy's voice was full of wonder and hope, and it almost broke Paul's heart. He had never even thought about being apart from her. At a red light, Paul stopped and closed his eyes for a moment. It was going to be hard to help the boys deal with their sadness, get used to living as a family, and deal with other people's biases. However, Paul Blake had never given up on a task, not even one this important. He said in a soft voice, "We'll figure it out together." The words filled the truck's quiet cab. They told each other that's what families do, and soon, they would be a family. When the light turned green, Paul stepped on the gas and drove toward the future he had chosen. Together, they would build that future one day at a time. After a few days, Paul pulled up to the simple two-story house he had lived in for 20 years. Some spots on the white paint were worn, and the front porch could use a new coat of stain. But it was strong and cozy, just like its owner. There were 3 boys in the back seat, sitting close to each other, with their small backpacks close to their chests. Paul said in a soft voice, "Well, boys," as he turned off the engine. "We're home." The word home seemed to carry a lot of weight. Kingsley, who was the most vocal, looked at his brothers before he spoke. He said in a low voice, "It's big." Paul led them up the concrete walk to the front door. He saw that they stayed close together, with Mike holding Isaac's sleeve. Once the key was in the lock, it clicked into place, and the door opened to show the living room. "Come on in," Paul said, moving out of the way to let them in. "This is your house now, too." The boys carefully walked into the room and looked around at the worn but comfortable couch, the coffee table that Paul had made out of wood, and the few family photos that were hanging on the walls. The wooden floors didn't make much noise from their shoes. "Would you like to see your rooms?" Paul asked as he watched his 3 sets of eyes get really big in shock. "Our rooms?" Again, Isaac said it in a voice that was barely above a whisper. Paul led them up the stairs with a nod. "Up here I have 3 bedrooms. They're not fancy, but they are yours. You can make them look however you want." He showed them each room, which was painted a neutral color, and had simple but comfy beds, dressers, and desks in it. Mike's small hand moved along the edge of his bed, and Isaac looked at the wooden desk with great interest. Kingsley stood by the door to his room and looked confused. Their tense bodies showed that they were scared. They didn't want to touch anything for fear that it would go away. He got down on his knees and knelt down next to them. "Listen, boys," he said, making sure to look each one in the eye. "I know this is all new and maybe a little scary, but I want you to understand something important." He took a moment to make sure they were paying attention. "This will not last. This is now your home, and I will always be here for you." Mike's bottom lip shook. "Promise?" Paul said, "I promise," and the sound of the younger boy's voice made his heart hurt. "We're a family now, and families stick together." Isaac's mouth twitched in a small smile, and Kingsley's shoulders loosened up a bit. Mike got up and put his arms around Paul's neck. All of a sudden, when Isaac joined them, Paul gave him a soft hug back and opened his arms wider. After he thought about it for a moment, Kingsley moved closer to finish their first family hug. As Paul held his three boys at that moment, he could feel the small smiles on their faces. They were tentative but hopeful, like the first light of dawn after a long dark night. In their small town of Pine Grove, word spread quickly. When Paul took the boys to the grocery store over the weekend, there were whispers following them down every aisle. Older women held onto their bags tighter, and parents drew their kids closer as the strange family walked by. Mrs. Rachel stood at the cash register with her silver hair styled just right, as always. She made a thin line with her lips when she saw Paul helping Mike choose a box of cereal. She then looked at Mrs. Peterson, who was bagging foods. "Did you hear about Paul Blake?" The three boys were picked out by Mrs. Rachel's voice, which echoed across the shop without consulting anyone in town first. "It's completely reckless." As Paul led his sons to the dairy area, he pretended not to hear, but he saw how Kingsley's shoulders tensed up at the sound of the words. What was he thinking? As Mrs. Rachel went on, her voice got louder. "A single man his age, who has never raised children, alone," she paused, meaning to say something else, but knew what she was going to say. As soon as other customers agreed, the whispers spread like weeds in a yard. The next Sunday, at the church potluck, Mrs. Rachel hung out with her regular group of friends. "It's not natural at all," she said, as she carefully stirred her iced tea. "Children need a mother's touch, and these boys, they'll need special attention, guidance from people who understand their background." Her words showed that she didn't agree. It was like wildfire around town. As the story spread, the owner of the hardware store where Paul got his supplies, all of a sudden, told Paul that they were out of the things he needed. They went to the local diner for breakfast and found that their usual booth was strangely taken. Mrs. Rachel made sure to say what was bothering her at every town meeting and social event. During the monthly town council meeting, she said, "It's not normal, and to be honest, I'm worried about the effect on our community. Paul Blake has always been a bit different, but this time, he's gone too far." Everywhere Paul and the boys went, people looked at them with disapproval and talked behind their backs. Some neighbors who used to be friendly to Paul crossed the street to avoid him when they saw him coming. Kids were told not to play with the Blake boys by their parents, so Isaac, Kingsley, and Mike were left alone on the field. Paul kept his head held high and his attention on his kids through it all, even though he felt like the judgment of his community was like a heavy blanket that they couldn't get rid of. Mike watched as Paul pushed his shopping cart down the produce lane and showed him how to choose ripe tomatoes. He held up a red fruit and said, "See how this one gives a little when you press it?" His rough hands were soft against the skin. "That means it's ready to eat." "Got it," Mike said with a nod, moving his little fingers on another tomato like Paul was doing. As Paul had taught them, Isaac and Kingsley were just ahead, picking apples with care. As other buyers walked around them, the fluorescent lights buzzed, and some looked at them with interest, while others avoided eye contact on purpose. Paul looked up and saw Bill Cooper, the owner of the nearby hardware shop, and someone he had known for 20 years. "Well, if it isn't Paul Blake," he said. Bill wore his usual plaid shirt and crossed his arms over his chest. "Hey, Bill," Paul said, trying to sound friendly, even though Bill's eyes had a strange look in them. Bill looked over at the three boys and made a face that was somewhere between a smile and a frown. "So what they said is true. You took in some city kids, right?" The way he stressed the words, city kids, made Paul's jaw clench. "These are my sons, Bill," Paul told him firmly, putting a hand on Mike's back to protect him. He could feel the boy shaking a little when he touched him. Bill let out a loud laugh. "Sons? Paul, come on. Do you really believe you can raise three boys from the city? You have no idea what their background is." Paul couldn't stand the way Bill talked about the setting. He saw that Isaac and Kingsley had stopped picking apples and were now watching the conversation. Their faces were carefully blank, but their eyes showed that they were hurt. Paul kept his voice steady and said, "I know about being a dad. That's what matters." Bill said, Sure, and shook his head. "But these kids aren't at all like the ones you usually deal with. If you get what I mean, they need a different kind of control." Paul's neck got hot, but he tried to stay cool. He knew that other customers were stopping their carts and faking to look at the produce while listening in on the argument. Paul said, "I appreciate your concern, Bill," but his tone made it sound like he wasn't. "But my boys and I need to finish our shopping." He looked at Mike, who had a tomato in his mouth so tight that it looked like it might burst. "Let's go pick out some potatoes, buddy," Bill called after them as they walked away. "Don't say no one told you, Paul. Some things aren't meant to be." With his hands on the handle so firmly that they turned white, Paul led his cart around the corner. The boys followed quietly, losing all of their excitement about going food shopping. The hurt from Bill's words hung in the air between them, making even something as easy as going grocery shopping feel like a minefield to avoid. Paul saw that this was just the beginning when he looked at his sad kids' faces. What else was going to happen if this was how a man he had known for 20 years was going to treat them? Over the weekend, a light fall breeze came in through the open windows of the Blake home. Paul had chosen to spend time alone with each of his sons, so that he could get to know the real people behind their tough exteriors. Isaac was in the living room, looking at the wooden coffee table with a strange interest. The 10-year-old traced the designs of grain that were carved into the wood surface. Paul said in a soft voice, "I made that table myself, so as not to scare the boy. About 5 years ago." Isaac's eyes got bigger. "You made this?" Paul agreed and sat down next to him. "I've worked with wood all my life. When I was about your age, my dad taught me." "Could you?" Isaac thought for a moment, and his voice was almost a whisper. "Could you teach me something?" Paul's chest felt warm. "Of course, I can," he replied. He got up and put out his hand. "Come on, I'll show you my workshop in the garage." When Isaac saw the tools on the wall and the wood shavings on the table, he got very excited. Paul showed Isaac a small piece of pine wood and took out 2 stools. Paul ran his rough hand over the flat surface and said, "This is the wood I started with. Simple, forgiving, perfect for learning." Isaac paid close attention as Paul talked about the different tools and how to use them. After a while of being quiet, the boy started to ask some interesting questions, which made Paul smile even more. "What's the hardest thing you've ever built?" Isaac asked, while holding a piece of sandpaper with great care, as if it were gold. Paul laughed. "Most likely the living room rocking chair. It took 3 tries to get the curves just right." He took a moment to think about those long nights of trying things out and seeing what worked and what didn't. But what? Sometimes the hardest things are the best ones in the end. The boy Isaac gave a serious nod, and Paul could see something change in his face, a small hole in the wall he had built around himself. Tell me about a time when you were my age, Isaac asked out of the blue, surprise. Paul leaned back against the workbench. This small act of trust made his heart race. He talked about his own life and how he learned to be a carpenter from his dad. He also talked about the mistakes he'd made and the lessons he had learned. As Isaac talked, he got closer and closer until he was leaning against Paul's side. Paul almost shed tears when he saw the simple act. Isaac said with a louder voice, "Maybe we could start with something small tomorrow. Like a birdhouse." "That's exactly how I began," Paul said, putting a light squeeze on Isaac's shoulder. "A birdhouse sounds perfect." They just sat there in quiet for a moment, smelling sawdust and the possibility of what could happen. Paul thought that the fact that they both liked building things might be more than just a hobby. It might have been the thing that brought them together. The afternoon showed him that his boys were very open and friendly when they weren't being watchful. The fact that Isaac liked working with wood was just the start. Paul was sure that with time and care, he could help each of them find their own way to be heard, to feel safe, and to be loved. Paul felt truly hopeful about their future. As a family for the first time since he brought the boys home. On a warm Saturday afternoon, the Riverside Town Fair was full of people having fun. Paul walked with Isaac, Kingsley, and Mike past brightly colored stands that sold corn dogs and cotton candy. The air was filled with the sweet smell of funnel cakes. But the warmth of the day couldn't warm up the cold looks that people were giving. "Can we try the ring toss?" Mike asked in a low voice, pointing to a booth that was full of toy animals. "Of course, buddy," Paul said with a smile, as he led them through the crowd. He saw how people moved out of the way as they went by, and how voices dropped to whispers. The boys squished together closer to him and tensed up their shoulders. Paul bought 3 sets of rings at the ring toss booth. With pride, he watched as each boy had a chance. Kingsley even won a small toy bear. The way they smiled at him made his heart swell. "Well, look who decided to join us," a sharp voice said, cutting through their happiness. Thomas Baker, Paul's next-door neighbor, was standing with his arms crossed. A small group of people had gathered to watch the events. "Afternoon, Thomas," Paul said calmly, putting his hand on Mike's shoulder to keep him safe. "Some of us have lived here our whole lives, building this town on good, old-fashioned values," Thomas said, in a voice that everyone could hear. He made a rude move at the boys. "And here you are, in a mockery of everything we stand for." Along with Paul, Kingsley tensed up. Little Mike pressed up against Isaac, whose face had turned pale. It got louder in the crowd, and more people stopped to watch. Paul said, "These boys are my family now," in a strong voice that belied the anger in his heart. "And family is the strongest value I know." Thomas laughed. "Family? Aren't you just trying to say something? Being proud of how forward-thinking you are. Blake, you're lowering the standards of this town and making everyone look bad." Paul saw that Mike's eyes were getting teary. Isaac gripped his fists together and stared at the ground. Kingsley's face showed a mix of pain and anger. They were now watching him to see how he would deal with the attack on their new family. Paul took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and looked Thomas straight in the eye. "The only value being ruined here is kindness, Thomas, and that's not coming from me or my boys." He spoke softly but firmly to his kids. "All right, guys. Let's get ice cream. I think I told each of you to get 2 scoops." As they walked away, Paul could feel the weight of the stairs and hear the whispers. But he kept his head up and led his boys through the crowd with a firm hand. "Did you mean what you said?" Isaac asked in a low tone. "About us being your family?" Paul stopped, knelt down, and looked his kids in the eyes. "Every word. Remember it always." Paul sat down with his 3 boys in their small living room. That night, after a quiet dinner of mac and cheese, as the table lamp's warm light fell on their faces, it cast soft shadows. The old grandfather clock's familiar tick filled the room with sound. Kingsley and Mike shared the worn-out leather couch, while Isaac sat on the floor with his legs crossed. When Paul said it softly, "I think we should talk about what happened today." Mike's shoulders stiffened right away. "Why don't they want us here?" Kingsley asked in a voice that was almost a whisper. The boy's words made Paul's heart hurt. He put his hands together and leaned forward in his seat. Some people are scared of new things. They don't know that different kinds of families exist. It might be better if... Isaac snapped, "No," and looked at his hands. "If what, son?" "If you had plain kids, white kids." Isaac's voice broke when he said the last words. Paul thought someone had hit him in the gut. He got up and sat down on the couch table, facing all three boys. He said, "Look at me, all of you," and waited for 3 sets of eyes to meet his. "You kids are just what I want. No matter what, you'll always be my kids." Mike's bottom lip shook. "But Mr. Baker said." "Mr. Baker is wrong," Paul said, in a strong but kind voice. "Wrong as hell. You belong with me here. This is now your home." "What if they never accept us?" Kingsley asked. "Then that's their loss," Paul said, putting his hand on Kingsley's shoulder. "They will miss out on getting to know 3 great young guys. What's important is us. We're building this family together." Mike started to cry, and Paul put out his arms. The younger boy jumped right in front of them. Isaac and Kingsley came after him, and soon Paul had all 3 boys in a tight hug. Their bodies were shaking from quiet sobs that let out the pain and fear they had been holding in all day. Paul said, "I love you, boys," and his voice was full of feeling. "I'm not leaving either. We're all in this together." The boys were in bed, and Paul was sitting alone in his kitchen with an old, cold cup of coffee. His worn-out hands shook a little as he thought about the look in his son's eyes. When he saw the fear, doubt, pain, and questions about their own worth, it hurt his heart. He was worried about how these fights might affect them in the long run. Would they always feel like they didn't belong? Would they take the mean words and critical looks to heart? Paul had learned the hard way that words could hurt more deeply than any wound, and leave scars that might never fully heal. As Paul ran his hands over his face, he could feel the weight of his duty pressing down on him. He had to do more than just love them. He had to teach them how to stand strong in the face of hate and protect them from it. It looked like everyone in town was out to break their hearts, so how could he protect them? The next morning, while the boys ate breakfast, Paul put 3 registration forms on the kitchen table. The sound of his pen scratching was mixed with the sound of spoons hitting breakfast bowls. "How would you boys feel about joining some sports teams?" Paul asked as he looked up from his work. "Isaac, I know you said you liked basketball." "Kingsley, you said you played baseball in high school." "Hi Mike, did I remember that you said you wanted to play soccer?" The boys' faces light up right away. Mike shook in his chair, and the milk in his bowl sloshed around dangerously. "Really? Let's play?" "Of course," Paul replied, smiling at how excited they were. "The youth leagues are starting their spring season soon." Kingsley said, with big, happy eyes, "I haven't played in a long time." On that Saturday, Paul drove them to the community center to sign up and get their uniforms fitted. Parents were filling out forms, kids were trying on jerseys, and coaches were putting away tools. The gym was very busy. As soon as they walked in, though, the normal chatter stopped. Isaac saw it first. As he looked around the gym, he slowed down and hunched his shoulders. Paul looked after him and saw what his son had already seen. His boys were the only black kids in the group of dozens of kids. Kingsley pressed against Paul's side, and Mike took Isaac's hand. The thrill that had been in the car ride over seemed to go away in an instant. Kingsley looked at the floor and said, "Maybe this isn't such a good idea." Paul got on his knees to look at them. "Hey, don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong here. Like every other kid in town, you can play sports." "But everyone's staring," Mike said in a low voice, as he shifted awkwardly. Paul told them, "Then let them stare. You guys should just enjoy yourselves and play the sports you love. I'll be at all of your games to cheer you on." Even though the boys nodded, Paul could tell that they weren't sure what to do. As they went through the sign-up areas, he saw that they were huddled together and whispering. They went from being excited to looking at each other nervously and moving slowly. At the uniform stand, the volunteer gave out jerseys while being overly polite and not making eye contact. Paul saw his boys walk into the changing rooms. They were moving more slowly, and their shoulders were hunched than before. Paul thought they would be proud to show off their new outfits when they came out. With Isaac in basketball green, Kingsley in baseball white, and Mike in soccer blue. What he saw instead were 3 uncertain faces turned back toward him. "You look great, boys," he said, trying to sound excited. Those uniforms fit perfectly. On the other hand, he could tell by the way they looked at the other kids, and the way they pulled at the fabric. What should have been a happy moment turned into another reminder of how different they were. Another thing that made it harder for them to fit in at their new home. The next day, Paul found Isaac hanging out in the garage for a long time. He was touching the old tools that were hanging on the rack and the worn workbench. As he looked at each hammer and wrench, the boy's eyes lit up with interest. Isaac's face lit up when he talked about crafts, which made Paul feel good. "Would you like to know more? We could turn this into a real workshop for you." "Really?" Isaac's eyes got bigger. "You'd do that?" "Of course," Paul said, as he walked over to the office table. "We could clean up this area and maybe get you some good tools. I know a lot about building things and could teach you all of it." In the afternoon, they cleaned the shed, put tools away, and made plans. Paul gave Isaac some old magazines about building things, and the two of them chose projects to work on together. The boy's excitement was contagious, and it made Paul think of how excited he was when his dad taught him how to use a saw for the first time. "Can we build a treehouse?" Isaac pointed to a picture in a magazine and asked. "Like this one?" "That's a big project," Paul said, as he looked at the picture. "But we can get better if you want to learn. Let's begin with something less important, okay?" Paul took Isaac to the hardware shop the following weekend. As they looked at the tools, Paul saw that some customers were staring or whispering. Putting himself between them and Isaac, he tried to protect the boy from their mean looks. In the lumber area, Isaac did what Paul had taught him and carefully looked at each piece of wood. He pulled out a board and said, "This one has fewer knots." Paul told Isaac, "Good eye, buddy," and ruffled his hair. "That's exactly what we're looking for." They paid for their things, and the cashier's smile looked fake, but Isaac was too excited about his new tools to notice. They set up Isaac's office together at home, making sure everything was in the right place. "These are yours now," Paul told Isaac, as he gave him his own tool belt. "But remember our safety rules, okay?" Isaac gave a serious nod and firmly buckled the belt around his waist. "Can we start building something now?" First, they built a simple birdhouse. Paul helped Isaac learn how to measure and saw while he worked on it. The boy worked hard, and his face lit up with concentration. He focused on making straight cuts, and his tongue stuck out a little. "You're so good at it," Paul told Isaac, as he carefully sanded the wood. "Just like you?" Isaac asked Paul, with hope in his eyes, looking up at him. Paul's throat got tight with feeling. "Okay, friend, the same as me." They shared tools and stories as they worked together in the garage, and Paul could feel their bond getting stronger. Isaac became more open. He asked questions about being a carpenter and talked about memories of his birth parents. Paul almost forgot about the problems they were facing outside their garage when he was in this space filled with sawdust and the smell of fresh wood. The next morning, Paul woke up before dawn. His contractor's alarm clock woke him up as the first rays of sunlight appeared over the horizon. In order to get an early start on the birdhouse project with Isaac, he put on his work boots and went to the shed. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. On the white garage door, harsh black letters scrawled words that made his stomach turn. Bad words and racial slurs were written on the place. where he and Isaac had spent so much time together yesterday. He made fists with his hands and felt heat rise in his neck. It made his blood boil to think that Isaac or any of his boys might have seen this. Paul turned his attention back to the house. His son was still sleeping soundly, not realizing that something ugly had come in. He walked straight to his truck and took out the extra paint he kept for touch-ups. He shook his hands as he forced the can open, but he was moving with purpose. This was hidden from the boys. They couldn't get this poison on them, he said. Paul's anger was running high as he rolled white paint over the mean words. He had known these people for decades, and they smiled at him in the hardware shop. They lived in the same neighborhood where he had helped build houses and fixed roofs after storms. He worked quickly because the air was thick and heavy in the morning. Even though it was cool, he had sweat beads on his face. Every time he hit the roller, it felt like a fight against the bias that was threatening the peace in his family. He whispered to himself, trying hard not to cry, "Just keep painting. Keep painting." As Paul put on a second coat, the sun rose higher, making sure that none of the bad words showed. As much as his shoulders hurt, the weight in his chest hurt even more. He knew that people would be against his plan to adopt the boys. But this level of hate shocked him to his core. Paul heard noises inside the house while he was cleaning his brushes. Soon, the boys would wake up. He quickly got his things together and covered up the work he had done in the morning. Paul knew what was hidden behind the garage door's fresh paint, even though it looked fine now. The thought made him feel sick to his stomach because it reminded him that the road ahead would be tougher than he thought. He had to force himself to take deep breaths to try to calm down. His strength, not his anger, was what the boys needed. As Paul walked back into the house to start making breakfast, he couldn't get rid of the feeling that his dream of fitting in might just be a pretty face for an ugly truth. That afternoon, Paul stood in front of the community center's bulletin board and looked at all the different notes and flyers. He saw a sign for the upcoming town cleanup day and looked at it. He signed all 4 of them up right away as helpers. Paul and the boys got there early with work gloves on the morning of the cleanup. While other people gathered, Isaac, Kingsley, and Mike stayed close to him. They looked down as familiar whispers began. Paul told Mrs. Rachel firmly, "We're here to help," meeting her shocked eyes as she gave out homework. "Place us where you need us most." They picked up trash along Main Street all morning. Paul was proud to see Isaac help an old woman pick up newspapers that were all over the ground, while Kingsley and Mike worked together to clean up the park playground. "Those boys of yours really know how to work," the owner of the hardware shop said as he walked by. It made Paul feel better because it was the first nice thing he had heard in weeks. They helped out at the library's book drive the next weekend. Mike, who liked to keep things in order, carefully rearranged the books in the children's area. Mrs. Willow, the librarian, who had been quiet at first, couldn't help but smile as she watched him sort the picture books by alphabetical order. In a voice Paul had never heard before, she told him, "He has a great eye for detail. He could help us more often." As Kingsley helped sort gifts at the food bank, his natural charm started to show. When he joked with other workers, his laugh was so contagious that it made even the most stern people smile. Every week, Paul and the boys went to places where help was needed. They painted fences around the elementary school, helped set up for bingo night at the senior center every week, and planted flowers in the town park. Things began to change slowly, almost too slowly to notice at first. Some of the whispers stopped. Averted gazes were replaced by occasional nods of agreement. Several people told Isaac how great his work was when he used the carpentry skills Paul had taught him to fix a broken shelf at the community center. "You have a big family there, Blake," said Tom Baker, a regular resident who hadn't talked to Blake before. Paul watched as the boys worked together to bring gift boxes down to the basement of the church. "Those kids are good." Paul's chest got tight with feeling. "Yes," was his simple answer. There. During one of their evening walks, Paul saw that Mrs. Johnson's fence was falling. The old woman had been living alone since her husband died, and the wooden slats were getting old, just like her house. The next morning, Paul got his tools together and told his boys, "Boys, we're going to help a neighbor today." Once they got to Mrs. Johnson's house, she looked through her blinds with wary eyes. The boys stood back and shuffled their feet nervously as Paul walked up to her front door. Paul said in a soft voice, "Mrs. Johnson, that fence needs some work. If you let me, I'd like to fix it for you." She was careful when she opened the door. "Paul Blake, I can't pay for repairs right now." "No charge," Paul said with a smile. "That's what everyone does." Paul worked steadily all morning, showing Isaac how to measure and cut the new boards while Kingsley and Mike helped take down the broken ones. From her porch, Mrs. Johnson watched, and her face slowly softened as she saw Paul teach the boys patiently and the boys eagerly follow along. As a treat, she brought out a plate of cookies and lemonade during their lunch break. "You boys must be thirsty," she said, in a friendlier tone than before. Mike said, "Thank you, ma'am," and carefully took a cookie. Along with the afternoon, Mrs. Johnson became more interested in the boys and started to ask them about school and their hobbies. Her eyes lit up when Isaac told her that Paul was teaching him how to build things. "You know," she said, "my Harold worked as a carpenter too. He would have liked such good work." The fence was strong and straight when they were done. Mrs. Johnson walked along it and gave it a thumbs up. She looked at them straight in the eyes for the first time and said, "You boys did a great job. You must make your father very proud." The boys looked at Paul for a moment and then back at Mrs. Johnson. Their faces showed worry. Paul saw Kingsley's small smile, and Isaac stood a little straighter when he was told that. At dinner that night, Mike spoke up while they were all sitting down. "Dad, did you hear Mrs. Johnson call you our dad? She even smiled at us," Kingsley said, his voice full of surprise. Isaac said in a low voice, "It felt good to have someone other than you see us as, you know, family." Hearing his boys talk about how they felt about the day made Paul's heart swell. The happiness in their eyes showed that they were seen as part of a real family. Paul got an idea from how well Mrs. Johnson's fence worked. During their weekend walks, he saw that the chairs at Memorial Park were in bad shape. The paint was peeling off and the wood was breaking apart from years of use. He asked the boys one Saturday morning, "Why don't we take some time to fix up those old benches?" They nodded, but there was a hint of doubt in their eyes about being so visible in the park. Paul put things like sanding, paint, brushes, and safety gear in his truck. Paul showed them how to sand the rough spots smooth while they worked on the first bench. When Kingsley and Mike tried to see who could strip the old paint faster, Isaac did it without any trouble. Kingsley showed Paul his work and asked, "Like this, Dad?" "Great," Paul said, his heart warming at the sound of Kingsley calling him Dad so easily. Now, a group of nearby kids who were playing stopped to watch them work. A girl about 7 years old came up to them and looked interested. She looked at their work and asked, "What are you doing?" Paul was shocked when Mike, who is usually the shyest person, said, "We're making the bench pretty again. Want to see?" The girl happily agreed, and Mike carefully showed her how to sand. Soon, more kids walked over, amazed at the change that was happening. At first, their parents were hesitant, but over time, they got closer. One boy asked, "Can I help?" And Paul quickly set up an over-the-air painting lesson for a group of excited kids. The boys were calm as they worked with the kids and showed them how to hold the paintbrushes and spread the paint out properly. Paul was proud to see Isaac calmly help a younger child stay away from the drips, while Kingsley and Mike made fun of their paint-splattered clothes with the other kids. Someone told Isaac, "Yeah, you're really good at this," as they looked at his careful brushwork. "Our dad taught us," Isaac said, giving Paul a thankful look. "He's teaching me all about working with wood and stuff." As they finished the last bench, a group of parents came up to them to say thanks. One mother gave the boys a warm smile. "These benches haven't looked this good in years," she noted. "You should be proud of yourselves." Paul noticed that his sons were more sure of themselves on the way home. They talked excitedly about their day, the kids they'd met, and the next project they might work on. "Can we fix up more things around town?" Kingsley was eager to ask. "Yeah," Mike replied. "Those kids were great. They might come back to help again." Paul looked in the rearview mirror and saw that his kids' happy faces showed that helping their community had helped them find their place in it. No longer were they just the strange people that everyone talked about. They were known for being willing to help. There was a mix of joy and worry on the first day of school. The boys asked Paul to help them pack their bags and make sure they had everything they needed. As Kingsley, 12, fixed his new shirt for the 10th time, he could feel the stress in his shoulders. "Remember what I said," Paul told them as he dropped them off. "You are now Blake's. Keep your heads up." But by the third day, Paul saw that Kingsley's behavior had changed. The boy, who is usually very chatty, became quiet at dinner and moved his food around on his plate. If Paul asked Kingsley about school, he would just shrug and say, "It's fine." Paul didn't find out the truth until Isaac pulled him away after dinner. "Some kids are being mean to Kingsley," Isaac said in a low voice. "They say things about our family and us. He is pushed in the hall, and no one does anything." Paul's heart shook. In Kingsley's room that night, he heard Squeaky crying. Kingsley was curled up on his bed when he opened the door. "I tried to be strong," Kingsley said, as he quickly wiped his eyes. "I didn't want to cause trouble." Paul sat down on the bed and put a soft hand on Kingsley's shoulder. "Son, you're not making trouble." "Yes, they are. We're going to fix this." Paul walked into Principal Warner's office the next morning with his jaw set, ready to do something. The principal's rude behavior made Paul even more angry. "Boys will be boys," Warner said, with a hand wave. "Kingsley needs to toughen up." Paul leaned in and spoke clearly. "No, my son doesn't need to get tough. Like all the other kids in this school, he needs to be treated with care. Because he's different, these kids are picking on him, and you're letting them." "Mr. Blake," Paul spoke up and said, "I'm not done. My boys are good. They should feel safe at school. Either you fix this, or I'll bring it to the attention of the school board. I'm sure you don't want me to do that." The principal's face turned red, but Paul's steady gaze made him move in a way that was uncomfortable for him. Warner finally said, "I'll talk to the teachers and students involved." Paul picked up the boys from school that afternoon. Jake's eyes were red, but Kingsley's face showed happiness when he saw Paul waiting. "The principal called an assembly today," Kingsley told her as they drove home. "He talked about honor and being mean to others. And my teacher moved some kids' places away from me." Paul nodded, and Kingsley's eye caught in the rearview mirror. He was firm. "Nobody messes with my boys." "You really stood up for me?" Kingsley asked in a soft but hopeful voice. "Always will, son. Will always." Paul was working in the kitchen that night when he felt arms around his waist. When he turned around, Kingsley was giving him a tight hug. Kingsley said in a whisper, "Thanks, Dad." The word "Dad" made Paul's heart race. He hugged all three of the boys together. Paul felt their trust in him building every day. So the next morning, he stood in his kitchen making a spread of sandwiches and snacks. He asked a few neighbors to join him for an afternoon get-together, so that the boys could meet other people in the neighborhood in a good way. "What if no one shows up?" Mike asked as he helped Paul put cookies on a plate. At that point, Paul smiled and said, "Then we'll have ourselves a feast." Even though his stomach was grumbling with worry. The doorbell rang at 2 o'clock. Mrs. Johnson stood on the porch with an apple pie she had made herself. She replied, "I thought we could use something sweet," and she smiled at each boy. Soon after, the McKee's family with their 2 kids showed up. From across the street, Mr. McKee's always waved at Paul. And now his kids were fascinated by the basketball hoop in Paul's yard. "Why don't you show them your jump shot, Isaac?" Paul said it. Isaac thought about taking the McKees kids outside for a moment before he did it. Inside, Mrs. Johnson talked to Kingsley about his favorite subjects at school, and Mike helped Paul serve lemonade. Even though only a few more neighbors slowly moved in, the environment stayed friendly and real. Mrs. Johnson said, "Your boys are delightful, Paul," and it was clear to everyone. "Mike here has such wonderful manners. And Kingsley was just telling me about his interest in science." Paul saw Kingsley's face light up when he was praised. The open windows let in the sound of Isaac and the McKees kids laughing as they played basketball outside. While taking a bite of another burger, Mr. McKee said, "We should do this more often. My kids could use some new friends in the neighborhood." As they looked at each other, the boys smiled small smiles. They seemed to really relax for the first time since moving in. Their shoulders stopped hunching in defense. As the afternoon went on, Paul saw his boys talking to their guests. Isaac showed the McKees kids some basketball tricks. Kingsley talked to Mrs. Johnson about his favorite books. And Mike was proud to show off his toy car collection to anyone who would look. Even though not as many people showed up as had been planned, the genuine kindness of those who did come meant the world. It was clear to Paul from the way his boys walked a little straighter and with a little more confidence. Just maybe, they were starting to feel like they fit. The next Sunday morning, Paul and the boys were taking their TIs in front of the mirror in their bedroom. Early that week, an invitation to the annual church picnic came. After a lot of thought, they decided to go. Paul put Isaac's collar back in place and said, looking sharp. The boys had been quiet all morning. Instead of chatting, they were tense. Smoke from the grill filled the air when they got to the church grounds. There were tables all over the yard with homemade meals and sweets on them. There were some known faces from the last get-together. The McKees family waved from where they were sitting under a big oak tree, and Mrs. Johnson called them over to her table. At the empty seats next to her, Mrs. Johnson said, "I'm glad you boys could make it. Have you tried the potato salad? The recipe comes from my grandma." Paul had not expected the mood to be as light as it was. Some kids asked Mike to play tag with them, and Isaac got into a talk about basketball with some teens from his school. But then a leader from the church, Mr. Peters, came over to their table. Even though he was being nice, he looked at the family with a look that said, "I don't like that." "Well, isn't this different?" Mr. Peters asked, and his voice rang through the room. "You know, Paul, when my wife and I adopted, we made sure to choose children who would fit in with our family values." It felt like the words were heavy in the air. As Paul watched his boy's eyes get darker, he could feel his jaw tighten. Kingsley slouched, and Isaac's talk with the other teens stopped all of a sudden. "My sons are perfect for my family, Mr. Peters," Paul said, in a steady, firm voice. "Love, respect, and kindness are what matter most to us." But the harm was already done. The ease of comfort they had been feeling went away. Mike ran back from his game because he could feel the strain and pressed up against Paul's side. The boys only cared about their food and didn't want to talk to anyone else. Paul held on tight to the steering wheel as he drove home, trying to control his anger. They were making such great work. The get-together at their house went well, and the boys began to feel more at ease in the neighborhood. Now, that one careless word had put up those walls again. Kingsley said, "Dad," in a low voice from the back seat. "May I have my own picnic next Sunday? Only us." In the rearview mirror, Paul looked into the eyes of his oldest son and saw both pain and confidence. His son knew that Paul would protect them and make things right in some way. "Of course we can, buddy," Paul said. He felt heavy in the heart because he knew that for every step forward, there would be one like this that would push them back. But when he looked at his boys, he knew that all of the hard times, setbacks, and moments of frustration were worth it. Paul taught the boys useful skills in the evenings, making everyday events into lessons about life. He watched his son carefully sand the edges of his first birdhouse. "Tonight, while sitting with Isaac in their homemade workshop. "Remember, go slow and steady," Paul told them in a soft voice. "Put your hands on the wood. It will let you know when it's smooth enough." As Isaac focused, his small hands moved slowly over the wood, and his tongue stuck out a little. Paul saw that the boy's initial fear had turned into confidence, as they had worked together like this for a few weeks. "Dad," Isaac asked, as he held up the piece to be looked at. When someone called him Dad, it made Paul's heart race. It still felt new and special. "That's great, kid. You're naturally good at this." Paul showed Isaac how to put on the last coat of weather protection while they worked together. As they took the finished birdhouse out to the yard, the boy's eyes lit up with joy. "Where should we hang it?" Paul asked as he kept the ladder steady. The old maple tree was shown by Isaac. "There, so we can see it from the kitchen window." As they put the birdhouse on the tree, Kingsley and Mike ran outside to watch. The four of them stood back and looked at the job after Paul helped Isaac down from the ladder. "You built that?" Mike asked his brother with wide-open eyes. Isaac stood a little taller and nodded. "Dad taught me how." Paul put his hand on Isaac's shoulder and said, "It's beautiful. You should be proud of yourself." Isaac's eyes filled with tears, which caught Paul off guard. "What's wrong, buddy? No one ever told me I could make something good," Isaac said in a low voice as he wiped his eyes with his sleeve. A tight hug was given by Paul, who felt the boy's arms around his waist. When the other boys joined in, it looked like a family hug that could never be put into words. Later that night, Paul watched from the kitchen window as two chickens looked at Isaac's work. Isaac stood next to him and smiled as the birds looked around their new home. It had been 10 years, and Paul was amazed at how much his boys had grown up. He stood next to Isaac, who was now a skilled builder with his own business. Isaac was at the community center sorting through boxes of canned goods. Kingsley, who had now become an elementary school teacher in the area, was helping elderly people bring their gifts inside. Mike, who was the youngest and is now a nurse at the town hospital, carefully put together medical items that people had given to the food drive. "Mr. Blake," Mrs. Johnson called out, and as she walked up to Paul, her wrinkled face lit up with joy. "Your boys are such a blessing to this neighborhood. Last year Kingsley taught my grandson, and that kid has never loved school more." Paul felt proud inside. "Thank you, Martha. They've turned into good men." Isaac was showing a young helper across the room how to stack the boxes correctly so they would stay in place. His calm instructions made Paul think of the early days when they worked together in the workshop. Kingsley's contagious laugh could be heard down the hall as he talked with past students who had come to help. Mike, on the other hand, organized the medical supplies with the same care he gave his patients. "Dad," Isaac yelled, "we need more boxes in the area where we sort." As Paul went to the storage room, he passed a group of people who had lived there for a long time. Even though most people smiled, he saw Mr. Parker and his wife giving each other those familiar, critical looks that he'd seen them do so many times over the years. Even after 10 years, some things still hurt, but Paul didn't feel it as much. His boys had already shown how good they were 100 times over. Their kindness and hard work spoke louder than any whispered criticism. "Your family has been such a gift," Susan Miller, who was in charge of the food drive, told Paul as she helped him move boxes. "Without your boys' help, we couldn't help half as many families. They come here every month without fail." Paul saw his kids working together. It was clear from everything they did that they were friendly with each other and wanted to help others. As kids, they were scared and unsure, but now they were strong, caring men who made him proud every day. Still, he saw how Mr. Parker pushed his grandkids away when Kingsley came close to their area. In their small town, some cuts took a long time to heal, if they healed at all. But Paul had learned to see the progress instead of the bias that still existed. The increasing number of real smiles and heartfelt thanks was much greater than the rare cold shoulder. "Hey, Dad," Mike called out as he walked up with a bag full of things. "Remember when we used to be scared to come to these community events?" Paul nodded as he thought back to those early days of fear and doubt. "Look at you all now," he said softly, as he watched his kids work with purpose and confidence. They were making a real difference in other people's lives. The next week, as Paul and his kids rushed to protect their home, the sky got darker and darker as the wind howled through the trees and bent them into dangerous angles. The rain hit the windows with more and more force. "Get the emergency supplies from the basement," Paul yelled over the noise of the storm. While Mike helped his dad board up the last window, Isaac and Kingsley ran downstairs. The storm hit with a lot of power. The family crowded together in the basement of their house while the storm raged above. The walls shook and groaned as the wind and dirt hit them. Just like he did when they were younger, Paul hugged his sons close during storms. Something awful cracked the air. There was water coming in through the basement roof. "We need to get out." When Paul yelled, they grabbed their escape bags. When they finally got upstairs, they saw that part of the roof had fallen, letting in a lot of rain. Just as they got to their truck, another part of the roof gave way. They could see other families running away from their homes through the rain. Some of them were on foot, holding on to whatever they could carry. The community center was set aside as an emergency shelter, so Paul drove there, being careful to avoid downed trees and power lines. They had walked these streets many times before, but now they were like rushing rivers that could carry away cars and other things. In the shelter, where it was very crowded, families cuddled together on cots and blankets. In the face of disaster, Paul saw how the normal social barriers had fallen down. Mrs. Parker, who had always stayed away, was now sitting next to them and shaking as she talked about how her roof had been ripped off. "The whole north side of town is underwater," someone said. "The Miller family lost everything." When Paul looked over, his kids were already busy doing something. Mike started giving the elderly their medicines, and Kingsley planned things to do to keep the scared kids quiet. Isaac and some other strong guys helped bring in supplies and set up more cots. Their own house was badly damaged and might not be able to be fixed. But Paul felt strangely calm as he watched his sons help their neighbors. The storm took away the small things that had been dividing the town for a long time, leaving only the fact that they were all human. More families, who were wet and scared, came through the night. The Blake men worked hard and gave everyone who came through the doors, blankets, hot coffee, and words of comfort. When there was so much damage, there was no time for bias or old grudges. Someone told Paul, "We've lost almost everything, but at least we're alive." When Paul looked around the crowded shelter, he saw that what they said was true. The storm took away their homes and things, but it also broke down some of the walls that had been between them. When things went wrong, everyone in the group had to work together, no matter how different they were. When dawn finally came, Paul and his kids were very worried as they made their way back to their house. When they got to their driveway, though, they knew they'd been lucky. Even though there were broken windows and shingles all over the yard, their house had surprisingly survived the storm thanks to Paul's careful repair and recent additions. Paul breathed, "Thank God," and ran his hand along the strong frame that he had built up just last summer. "Guys, get your work gloves ready. There are people that need our help." They put tools and groceries in Paul's truck. He had been ready for years because he had worked in building, and now his skills would be very important. They could see how bad the damage was as they drove through the trash streets. Roofs were crushed by falling trees, power lines hung dangerously, and trash was all over the place. At the McKee's family's house, which was their first stop, Paul got to work right away fixing their partly collapsed roof. Isaac did a good job as a helper by giving his dad tools and learning as he worked. While that was going on, Kingsley and Mike gave out water bottles and emergency goods from the back of the truck. When the boys came up to her broken porch with water bottles and ready-to-eat food, Mrs. Watson snarled, "We don't need your help." Even though her house was a mess behind her, she stood there with anger and pride burning in her eyes. Kingsley kept his cool even though his shoulders sagged. "It's not money, ma'am. Everyone here lives nearby." Paul ran into the same kind of pushback down the street when he offered to help Mr. Peterson fix his broken fence. The old man went back and forth between pressing need and deep-seated mistrust, until he finally muttered, "I'll handle it on my own," even as the wind swayed his fence dangerously. Still, for every person who turned them down, there were others who gladly took their help. The Johnsons were glad that Paul could fix their broken windows. And Mrs. Rodriguez gave the boys a teary-eyed hug when they helped her clear the tree off her road. During the whole day, they worked hard. Paul went from house to house, fixing roofs, making walls stronger, and making sure buildings were safe. His kids learned a lot from working with him, both about building and about being kind. They gave out goods, helped clean up the mess, and comforted neighbors who were shocked. Mike whispered to Paul, "I don't understand," while they were taking a water break. "Even now, some people would rather suffer than accept our help." Paul wiped his forehead with the towel and looked at his younger son with soft eyes. "Son, the hearts of people sometimes take longer to fix than their homes. We still help because it's the right thing to do." As the sun rose higher, Paul and his boys kept going on their task to help people through the damaged streets. The damage seemed to go on forever, but their resolve never weakened. At each stop, they worked quietly and quickly, letting their deeds speak louder than words. When Paul's family came by, Mrs. Chen always rushed her grandkids inside. She watched from her porch as Isaac and Kingsley cut down the heavy branches that had fallen through her garden. She went crazy when she saw how carefully they took care of her prized rose bushes and saved what they could. In a weak voice, she asked, "Would you guys like some lemonade?" As soon as they politely said yes, her face changed in some way. While this was going on, Paul was on the Rodriguez family's roof, showing Isaac how to properly fix a leak. He pointed to the damage and said, "See how the water follows this path? We need to work from the bottom up." Isaac paid close attention to everything his father said while he fixed things with his hands. Mr. Rodriguez stood below and crossed his arms as he watched them work. At the town meetings, he was one of the biggest people who spoke out against Paul's adoption. He still had doubts, but as he watched the father and son work together, they started to feel better. "Your boy's got a good head on his shoulders," Mr. Rodriguez said, as Paul got off the ladder. "Natural talent for this kind of work." Paul felt proud inside. "All of my boys do," was his simple answer. As they moved through the neighborhood, more walls came down. Mrs. Patterson was totally won over by Mike's gentle way with her scared cat. Kingsley's quick thought stopped the Miller's basement from getting any worse from water damage. A family that had crossed the street to avoid them thanked him with a handshake. By the middle of the afternoon, something amazing was taking place. People in the neighborhood who had turned down their help before were now asking for it. The Watson kids had never been allowed to play with Paul's boys. But now, they were working with them to clean up the neighborhood playground. "You taught them well," Mr. Johnson told Paul as they watched. The boys set up a line of people to pass sandbags. "Those are good kids you're raising." Paul watched as his sons played. Isaac led the sandbag line with confidence. Kingsley comforted a crying baby. And Mike gave his neighbor an empty water bottle. They showed the principles he had worked so hard to teach them in everything they did. They were kind, strong, and determined to always do what was right, even when it was hard. "They taught me just as much," Paul said, in a soft voice that was full of feeling. He saw, as his boys slowly but surely changed people's minds. In the neighborhood, through small acts of kindness and hard work, Paul and his boys went to Mrs. Rachel's house later in the afternoon. The typhoon did a lot of damage to her property. Her beloved garden was destroyed, and her front porch was collapsed. As they walked up to her door, she stood there wringing her hands together. This was the same woman who had been so mean to Paul about his choice to adopt the boys just a few months before. People in the neighborhood were filled with doubt because of what she said. Now, though, when she looked at her family, her eyes were filled with tears and maybe a little shame. I could use some help," she said softly, her voice not as sharp as usual. The boys did something right away after Paul nodded. Isaac looked at the damage to the porch while Kingsley and Mike started to clean up her yard from the fallen branches. They worked carefully, taking extra care with her prized rose bushes. From her chair on the yard, Mrs. Rachel watched them, following their every move. She saw how Paul taught each boy with love and care, and how well the whole family worked together. The sight of Mike carefully pulling one of her clay gnomes out from under a downed branch brought tears to her eyes. She said out of the blue, "I was wrong about you all," her voice shaking. "The things I said, the way I treated you." She stopped and used a cloth to wipe her eyes. "You're showing more Christian charity right now than I've shown in all my years of Sunday preaching." When the boys heard those words, they were shocked for a moment. Paul saw Kingsley's shoulders slightly straighten, and Isaac's eyes light up with surprise and hope. "These boys," Mrs. Rachel said next, pointing at Paul, "are a blessing to this community. And you are the father they deserve." Then she looked at the boys. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see it." The simple words had a huge meaning. Paul saw the quiet joy in his boys' faces light up, and he saw them move with more confidence as they worked. No longer was it just about fixing damage from the storm. Something much deeper needed to be healed. When they were done, Mrs. Rachel insisted on giving them tea and cookies on her porch, which she had just fixed up. At first, the boys were a little stiff, but as she told stories about the town's past, they slowly got more comfortable. She treated them like any other kids in the neighborhood. Isaac spoke up on the way home. "Dad, did you see how she looked at us? It seemed like we were just regular kids." The wonder in his son's voice broke Paul's heart. Kingsley and Mike both agreed, and their eyes showed the same mix of wonder and happiness. "Maybe things are really changing," Mike said in a hopeful tone. The steps of Paul's sons were lighter than they had been in months as they walked ahead of him. Some people might have thought Mrs. Rachel's change of heart was small, but he knew it wasn't. It felt like moving a rock in their world, where they were always fighting to be accepted. The next day, Paul and his boys were at Mrs. Johnson's house, where the storm had bad damage to her windows and tore off parts of her roof. The old woman was one of the first people to be nice to them, but Paul could still see the fear in her eyes when they first got to town. While Paul was putting on new shingles, Isaac gave him tools from below, and Kingsley and Mike helped clean up her yard from all the trash that was lying around. Mrs. Johnson watched from her porch, where a bowl of cold lemonade was already set out. She whispered, "Paul," and her voice was shaking. "Could you come down for a moment?" He slowly climbed down the ladder while wiping the sweat off his forehead. The boys got closer because they could tell her voice meant something important. Mrs. Johnson looked at each of them with teary eyes. She began, "I need to tell you something," eating her hands around on her apron. "When I heard you were going to adopt these boys, I wasn't sure. I'm sorry to say it, but I did it." Paul could feel his throat getting tight as he looked at his boys' faces. They did not move at all while they listened. "I grew up in a different time," she said, and her voice cracked. "But after seeing how beautiful your family has become over the past few months, it was awful, Paul. I was so wrong." She put out both hands and took one of Paul's worn-out hands. "These boys are a gift to our community, and you're the finest father I've ever seen." Paul's eyes filled with tears as he gently squeezed her hand. He looked at his boys and saw that they were standing a little straighter, and that their faces were getting more emotional. "The way you've all rushed to help everyone after this storm." Without a second thought about how some folks treated you before, Mrs. Johnson wiped her eyes and shook her head. "It's taught me more about love and family than all my years in this town." Isaac took a step forward. His voice was soft but steady. "Please forgive me, Mrs. Johnson. We really appreciate that." She opened her arms, and to Paul's surprise, all 3 boys ran up to touch her. He couldn't stop crying as he watched them. He had hoped for more than just acceptance of what was going on and real change. "Let's get some lemonade in you all before you finish that roof," Mrs. Johnson said, with a sniffle, and her shoulders back. As the boys walked by her on their way to the porch, she patted each one on the cheek. It was the same kind of kindness she showed her own grandkids. Paul was struck for a moment by how beautiful it was to see his sons sitting back and smiling while taking cookies from a woman who had become like family. Seeing hearts change one person at a time was everything he had asked for in those hard early days. More helpers came to help the town get back on its feet the next morning. Paul and his boys were cutting down a downed tree when they heard sounds they knew coming toward them. They were shocked to see Tommy and his friends. These were the same boys who had been mean to Kingsley at school not long before. The group stood there uncomfortably for a moment, moving their feet around. Tommy, who was in charge of the group, took the first step forward with his eyes on the ground. We came to help," he said in a low voice. "If that's okay." Paul kept a close eye on his boys, especially Kingsley, whose shoulders tensed up when he saw the people who used to pick on him. But before he could say anything, more neighbors with tools and supplies showed up. Mrs. Rodriguez from the corner store, Mr. Chen from the hardware store, and even some parents whose kids used to be pulled away from Paul's boys to play, showed up. Tommy sucked in his breath and looked right at Kingsley. He said in a broken voice, "I'm really sorry for how I treated you. All of us are. We were wrong, and it's great to see that you guys help everyone, even people who were mean to you." He quickly wiped his eyes. "Could you forgive us?" The other boys honestly agreed with Tommy's apology. Kingsley first looked at his brothers and then at Paul. Paul gave Kingsley a big smile and a nod. "Yeah," Kingsley said in a low voice. "We can work together." The group split up into groups. Tommy and his friends worked with Paul's boys to clear up the mess. As they worked together, the awkwardness went away and was replaced by real teamwork. Moving tools back and forth and sharing water bottles. They even laughed when Mike sprayed them all with the hose by mistake. As the morning went on, more neighbors showed up. Mrs. Anderson, who had crossed the street to get away from them before now, brought lunches for everyone. Mr. Peterson worked with them and taught the boys how to properly stack sandbags, because he wouldn't let his daughter play with Mike. Tom said to Kingsley, "You know, while taking a water break, my dad says we were lucky to have your family move here. Taught us all something important about how to judge people." Kingsley smiled, and it was a real smile that made Paul feel proud. The other people who used to pick on the boys crowded around and asked if they could join the basketball games when things were back to normal. Paul had never really thought that the situation he was in would change into something he had never even dreamed of. His sons would be working with kids who had once avoided them. People in the community were changing not only what they said, but also what they did by working together and knowing each other. The next morning, Paul and his boys stood in front of their broken-down house and thought about how much work they had to do. There were several holes in the roof where trees had gone through, and the walls had ugly stains from water damage. While Kingsley and Mike picked up loose shingles in the yard, Isaac held onto his toolbox and was ready to help. "We'll fix it up, boys," Paul said, trying to sound sure of himself, even though the job was huge. But before they could start, the street was filled with the noise of trucks. To their surprise, a group of cars pulled up, full of building supplies and eager workers. Mrs. Johnson got out of her son's pickup truck first, then Tommy and his parents. It was Mr. Chen from the hardware shop who showed up with new shingles and boxes of nails. There was even Mrs. Anderson, who brought her husband, who ran a building business. "You've helped everyone else," Mrs. Johnson said, with wide eyes. "Now, it's our turn to help you." The boys were frozen as they saw neighbors They had never talked. To come into their yard with tools and materials. Paul got a lump in his throat when Mr. Anderson came up to him with plans. He put his hand on Paul's shoulder and said, "My crew and I can handle the roof. You just tell us where you need us." The work started right away. Isaac was very proud as he taught Tommy's dad how to hold a hammer the right way, just like Paul had taught him. Kingsley and Mike worked with people who used to be their peers. They used ladders to pass things up to the adults. Inside, Mrs. Johnson led a group of women who fixed the water damage and painted the walls again. Even better, they brought new curtains to replace the ones that the storm had ripped. "Look, Dad," Mike yelled and pointed to where Tommy and his friends were working to put in new floorboards. "They're fixing my room first." Paul watched as the people in his neighborhood fixed up his house and made it a home again. People who used to talk about them behind their backs now ate lunch with his boys, asked what they liked, and treated them like family. By late afternoon, the roof had been fixed, the walls were dry from new paint, and the yard was free of junk. As the boys walked through their fixed-up house, they couldn't help but smile and touch the walls, as if to make sure it was real. "This is what community looks like," Mrs. Johnson told Paul in a soft voice, as she watched the boys show their friends their rooms with pride. "We were blind before, but your family helped us see what really matters." As Paul was too touched to speak, he nodded. His boys were finally home, and I mean that in every way. The people who helped fix up the house were healed, but what was more important was that their hearts were also healed. The mayor asked Paul's family to share their story at the next town hall meeting. Isaac, Kingsley, and Mike were nervous as they stood at the platform. Their father was standing behind them, which gave them strength. The community center was full of people who had been there to help clean up after the storm. Kingsley spoke first because he was the oldest. His voice was shaking a little at first, but it got stronger as he spoke. "Years ago, we lost everything, but then we found something we never expected: a father who chose us, who fights for us every single day." Next, Isaac stepped forward and looked through the crowd until he saw Mrs. Johnson. "People were mean to us when we first got here, but Dad taught us that love doesn't care about race. He showed us how to be strong when people were mean to us, and how to help people even when they didn't want it." His younger brother Mike said, "Our dad never gave up on us, and he never gave up on this town either." No one in the room could hold back tears. They used to get the worst reviews from Mrs. Rachel, who wiped her face with a tissue. Mr. Chen gave them a thumbs up from his seat as he thought about how the boys had helped pass out emergency goods during the storm. People in the neighborhood stood up one by one to share their own stories of change. Toy's mom told him through tears that after becoming friends with the boys, her son had taught her how to accept others. Mr. Anderson talked about how working with Paul and his kids had changed the way he thought about family. Mrs. Johnson stood up and said, "These boys and their father show us that family isn't about having the same skin color. It's about love, dedication, and the courage to stand together even when times are tough." People all over town had honest talks after hearing what the boys said. At the diner, people talked about their biases in an open way for the first time. In church groups, people thought about how they had behaved in the past and promised to do better. The nearby newspaper wrote an article about Paul and his boys, talking about how their unwavering love and service had helped the area get better. Paul was proud to see his kids speak out for change. They talked to younger kids at school assemblies about what they had been through. Their story spread beyond their small town and made people in nearby towns think about how they feel about adopted families. Even in small ways, the changes were clear. Everybody started having Paul and the boys over for dinner. At the grocery shop, the suspicious looks were changed to friendly greetings. The town's annual festival group even asked the family to help plan the next event, because they wanted their ideas on how to make it more open to everyone. The boys stayed humble throughout it all, and always said that their father's love gave them the strength to keep going. They were live proof that love could bring people together across any gap. And their presence in the community continued to break down old barriers and knit hearts together. Mrs. Rachel stood at Paul's front door and scratched her purse strap with her hands. As Paul opened the door, the porch was lit by long shadows from the setting sun. His tired face showed shock. The boys behind him stopped playing their board game and watched carefully from the living room. The first thing Mrs. Rachel said was in a voice that no one had ever heard before, "Paul, I'd like to talk to you and the boys." Paul thought about it for a second, then nodded and moved out of the way to let her in. As she walked in, the boys stood up straight. Their faces were hard to read because they had been hit and glared at by her for years. Mrs. Rachel took a big breath. Her normally stiff calm broke as tears filled her eyes. Her voice was shaking as she said, "I've been thinking a lot about how I treated you all, and what I said and did." She stopped and used a cloth to wipe her eyes. "I was wrong, so terribly wrong." The boys looked at each other blankly, because they were not used to seeing Mrs. Rachel so weak. Paul stood still and put his hand on Mike's shoulder to protect him. "When the typhoon hit," she went on, "I saw how hard you all worked to help everyone, even people who had been mean to you. I saw how much love and support this family has for each other." Her voice broke. "And I realized how blind I'd been, how my bias had kept me from seeing what was right in front of me, beautiful family." As Mrs. Rachel turned to face them, Dick's eyes were wet with tears. "I'm so sorry for the pain I caused you, for every cruel word, every disapproving look, every time I made you feel unwelcome in your own town." She looked at every boy one by one. "You should have had more. You earned to be greeted with open arms." Paul took a deep breath and swallowed hard. Her words moved him deeply. Kingsley stepped forward. He was often the one she was most critical of. "Thank you, Mrs. Rachel," he said, not loudly. "That means a lot to us. Your father has raised you to be remarkable young men," she said, wiping away tears, "and I hope you can find it in your hearts to forgive an old woman who took far too long to learn what really matters." When the boys looked at Paul, he gave them a positive nod. Mike, the youngest, was the first to move forward and give Mrs. Rachel a soft hug. She jerked back in shock before sinking into the hug, her shoulders shaking with tears. "We forgive you," Isaac said, together with his brother. Kingsley joined them, and soon Paul was also in the group. "Thank you," Mrs. Rachel said, in a deep voice, filled with feeling. "Thanks for showing this town what real family and strength look like." Neighbors met in the town square for the party, and it was very busy. Strings of blinking lights hung between the recently fixed-up buildings. And around the square, tables were full of sharing food. With fresh flowers and boughs on it, a makeshift stage had been set up in the middle. Paul and his boys were sitting in the front row. They looked a little uneasy with all the attention. Kingsley and Mike looked at each other nervously as Isaac messed with his collar. They felt better when Paul put his hands on their shoulders. As he looked around, his eyes got misty. Mayor Johnson took a deep breath and spoke into the microphone. "Tonight, we're here to celebrate not just the rebuilding of our town, but the rebuilding of our hearts," he told us. Toward Paul and the boys, he made a sign. "This family showed us what it means to be on the same team." Given how they were treated, some people might have turned their backs on them, but they stepped up to help everyone in need. Mrs. Johnson went on stage with her husband, her voice shaking with emotion. "I saw Paul and these boys work from dawn until dusk, fixing roofs, cleaning up, and helping out wherever they could. They never asked for anything in return, not even from people who were mean to them." Several of the other neighbors took turns telling their stories. The owner of the hardware store, Mr. Peterson, talked about how the boys had gotten other teens to bring supplies to homes for the elderly. With tears in her eyes, Miss McKees talked about how Paul and Isaac fixed up her porch when she couldn't afford to fix it herself. Many people were moved to tears by Mrs. Rachel's speech. These four souls showed us that family doesn't depend on where you're from or how you look. It's about love, loyalty, and sticking together through the real and imagined storms of life. From the first speech, the boys sat up straighter, and their discomfort turned into quiet satisfaction. When Paul saw his sons get the praise they earned, his eyes lit up. Paul squeezed Isaac's shoulder because his own heart was so full it would burst. When the mayor came back to the microphone, he held up an award. "Paul Blake and his son Isaac, Kingsley, and Mike, please come up here." As the family walked to the stage, cheers filled the square. "This plaque will hang in our town hall as a reminder of your service and the lesson you taught us about judgment, love, and community." The people in the crowd stood up and cheered louder. People wiped their tears away and cheered. People could see Paul's family togetherness as he stood with his arms around his boys. They were no longer the subject of whispers and criticism, but of admiration and respect. Paul walked up to the microphone and put his worn-out hands on its sides. He stood there for a moment and looked out at the sea of familiar faces. These were faces that used to judge him, but now showed acceptance and love. His boys stood a few steps away and looked at him with pride and love in their eyes. Paul began with a heavy heart. "I never set out to change anyone's mind. All I wanted was to give 3 wonderful boys a home and the love they deserved." He stopped and took a deep breath. "When I brought Isaac, Kingsley, and Mike home for the first time, knew things would be hard." When he looked at them, tears came to his eyes. "But these boys showed me what real strength looks like." As he went on, his voice cracked. "They stood tall in the face of every whisper, stare, and mean word. They taught me more about bravery than I could ever teach them." Paul used the back of his hand to wipe his eyes. "As I stand here today, I understand what family really means. It's not about having the same blood or looks. It's about hearts that beat together." People in the square were glued to his every word. Even the breeze in the evening seemed to have stopped. "People can change," Paul said, pointing to the rebuilt buildings around them. "Love can win over fear, and differences can bring us together instead of tearing us apart." His kids came forward to stand next to him when he reached out for them. "While the storm in our town was terrible, it did more damage than just destroy houses. Fear and bias were washed away." Now, Paul's tears were running freely, but he didn't try to hide them. "Look at all of us now. We're standing together as a community, not as different homes or races. My boys and I aren't just putting houses back together again. We're putting up walls between hearts." Isaac leaned against his dad, and Paul put his arm around him. They pressed close together too, making a tight circle of family love right there on stage. "Thank you," Paul said softly, "for opening your hearts to us. For letting us show you that love knows no boundaries. For becoming the extended family these boys deserve." He looked down at his sons with a proud, fatherly look on his face. "And thank you, boys, for making me the proudest father any man could ask for." The crowd was crying out loud now because Paul's words made them feel so much. A cloth was used by Mrs. Johnson to wipe her eyes, and Mr. Peterson took off his glasses to wipe away tears. Mrs. Rachel, who was standing near the front, had tears running down her face too. "This journey," Paul went on, "has taught us all that acceptance, understanding, and love are better than wood and nails when it comes to building a strong foundation. And those roots are strong enough to stand up to any storm." It had been 10 years since Paul's last visit to town. The leaves were dancing around his pickup truck. When he looked back, he saw 3 grown men following him in their own cars. This made him feel very proud. Isaac, Kingsley, and Mike were even better than he had hoped. The town square looked different, but the same at the same time. Even though there were new shops on the streets, the sense of community that had grown in the hard days after the storm was still there. Banners honoring the 10th anniversary of the rebuilding flapped in the wind. "Dad!" As they parked, Isaac yelled, his tool belt still around his waist. No matter the event, he had taken over Paul's construction business 3 years before, which gave his father a well-deserved break. Along with them on the sidewalk were Kingsley, who was now a well-known doctor, and Mike, who was now a high school teacher. When Paul looked at his kids, he saw strong, sure of himself men who carried themselves with honor and purpose. Mr. Blake, voice of Mrs. Johnson, could be heard. Even though she was older and used a cane to walk, her eyes still sparkled with the same brightness they had when they were new. She gave each of them a hug. "My stars, look how handsome you boys have become." People, both known and unknown, started to crowd around them. The kids, who were babies during the restart, were now excitedly pointing at Mike, who had come back to teach at their school. Parents waved at Kingsley because they were thankful that he took such good care of their kids at his practice in the next town over. "Remember when we all thought Paul had lost his mind?" Mr. Peterson laughed and shook his head at how prejudiced he used to be. "It looks like he was the smartest person in town. These boys didn't just help us rebuild our homes. They also helped us rebuild our hearts." Paul stayed put and watched as his sons walked through the crowd and said hello to neighbors and old friends. All of the handshakes, hugs, and memories they shared showed how far they'd all come. The town that used to talk about them behind their backs now praised them as their own. "You did good, Paul," Mrs. Rachel told him, her voice soft from feeling. "These boys of yours, they've made us all better people." She gently put her hand on his arm. "And you showed us what real fatherhood looks like." It was almost time for Paul to cry as he watched Isaac show his old woodworking teacher pictures of the handmade furniture business he had started on the side. Kingsley was talking with the town's mayor about the free medical clinic he ran on the weekends. And Mike was telling the mayor about the great things his students had done. Love that didn't seem to belong in this small town before now flowed like the river that ran through it. Paul's family set seeds of change that grew into something beautiful that will last. They didn't just leave behind the buildings they helped fix up. They also left behind hearts they changed. If you enjoyed the story of Paul, Isaac, Mike, and Kingsley, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.